Well, first of all, how do you function when you don't have a head?
Right.
And AU as the supposed head is a useless entity, it's dead. There is no leadership there. The African Union Commission is totally useless. And so until we have a head to really lead these institutions, there's no blood coming out of the head.
Right.
There's no leadership. So the lack of leadership at the AU paralyzes the other organs.
What would you attribute that lack of leadership to?
It goes back to 1963.
Sure.
When our African leaders came together in an effort, of course, at the invitation of Emperor Haile Selassie, in an effort to regroup an Africa that speaks with one voice, an Africa that had one military, an Africa that had one stock exchange, one monetary policy, monetary fund, an Africa with one customs union. We failed in 1963 to build an Africa that was united, that spoke with one voice. The Casablanca group, who were saying Africa for the Africans, African Union now. And unfortunately, there were only 7 countries.
Right.
They lost. The Monrovia group, who were the majority, NATO was in full force. Brown envelopes, as we call them now, were being passed around. A lot of infiltration of the agenda. Consequently, what should have been an outcome that would have given Africa, that would have put Africa on a different trajectory, was destroyed. Right. Thanks to NATO and their job. They're good. They're so good at divide and conquer. They were in full force in 1963. Right. They followed with all efforts of the leaders that came up, the African leaders who were Pan-African, who tried to pull back from colonization. They assassinated them. We had citizens in the United States, if you look at the Black Panther coming out of the Caribbean, the likes of Marcus Garvey. We had all these Pan-Africanists, all these activists. They systematically killed all of them.
Right.
So we went through a period where people got scared. They backed off. They were afraid to speak the truth.
Right.
NATO has been in full force.
Right.
The infiltration of the African and all people of African descent by certain powers that want to see to it that Africa is forever the provider of natural resources, provider now of cheap labor. They are still in full force. Let's go back to the African Union. Let's look at when the current chair was appointed. Everybody that tried to run with him, run against him, they were eliminated. Right. Can you tell me the entire continent could not find somebody to run against Musa Faki Mahamat?
Right.
But that's what happened.
Right.
He ran completely unopposed. Brown envelopes were circulating.
Your sentiments also on some of the divisions that colonial pasts have contributed to in Africa. For example, your Anglophone countries and your Francophone countries. Surely that also culminates in challenges going forward at the moment?
Well, let me look at starting with the Francophone countries.
Right.
The Pact for the Continuation of Colonization remains in full force.
Right.
Over 90 to 95% of the businesses in those countries are French companies. French companies have the first right of refusal of all contracts, big, small, private, public, to this day. French military is in each and every one of those countries, and France can invade them without notice.
Right.
If they feel their interests are being threatened. As we speak, every one of them, there's a French desk at the presidential palace, French desk at the central bank, French desk at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to make sure that what France wants gets done.
Right.
You look at the bank reserves.
Right.
Right now, when we started back in the 60s, it was about 85% of the bank reserves were going to French treasury. It's now down to about 50 to 60%. They are still sending their bank reserves. And if those countries should wish to get some of that money, they can only access up to what they put in last year as a loan at commercial interest rates.
What?
Your own money. So when you look at some of those atrocities being committed to this day, if a leader tries to pull back from that abuse, they get assassinated. Right. There will be instability within their countries. The average African leader is under siege from the former colonizers, is under siege from the West. They have to tread a thin line just to run and govern their countries.
Right. You once spoke about how the IMF and the World Bank make African countries poorer by extending expensive loans to them and also giving them the same amount of loans to their Western counterparts at a lesser interest rates. How has that hidden agenda affected development in the continent?
Huge. African countries are finding themselves in this conundrum where they have these huge loans that they can never repay. You have countries like Zimbabwe, GDP of about 11, 12 billion, 6.5 goes towards loan repayment. Right. How do you survive that?
Yeah, you can't.
You know, you have countries, the minimum average an African country is paying on loan repayment is around 35%. The majority around 50%. So half of your GDP goes towards paying loan repayment. Zimbabwe, we're still paying loans from Ian Smith.
Right.
Really?
It does.
Talk to me. This is ridiculous.
It is. And it does seem as though that some could say that the Pan-African dream could actually be a pipe dream. Is it a realistic position in 2023 to expect some of the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism's vision to be realized as we're going forward?
Well, what's really needed, we need to speak up.
Okay.
Why are we still going to the United Nations as Africans? That is a useless entity. It's not for us. The largest voting bloc in the United Nations are the African nations. We don't have a seat on the table. Why do we go there? We go to the United Nations to vote on their issues. They pay African countries, vote with us on this issue, vote with us on this issue. We have no business going to the United Nations, period. We need to tell Secretary Guterres, thank you very much, but we're no longer going to attend United Nations. It's not our entity. Until we have true representation there. Goodbye.
All right. Now, looking at also...
Let me say this.
Yeah.
The same is true
Sure.
with every engagement with the West.
All right.
For example, Zimbabwe and many other African countries, the remains of our ancestors who they murdered are still sitting in jars in their countries. Why are we going to engage them?
Right.
We want those remains returned with repercussions.
Right.
Until that's happened, everybody from your country, out. If you were former Portuguese colony, all Portuguese, get out of my country. I love it remember when there was this rift between President Mugabe and Prime Minister Tony Blair. And Blair was like, we're coming to take all the British out of Zimbabwe, we're airlifting them. And the response President Mugabe was, listen, I've given all my police and military that if you see any British citizen that wants to get out, escort them to the nearest exit point. Get out. If we can just make that position, your government is abusing us. Your government is refusing to give us back our ancestors, the remains of our ancestors who they murdered. Your government is refusing to give us back our artifacts, precious artifacts, priceless, that they stole. Until these wrongs, these blatant wrongs are righted, every British citizen get out. Every Portuguese citizen get out. Every German citizen get out. Let's see how quickly things will change.
Move from there.
It is those citizens who are going to now go to their government and say, we didn't know you were doing that. Let me make this point clear. The citizens do not know of the crimes that are being committed by their governments. So let's put the power back to the people. Let's remind the people that every constitution starts with we, the people. So let's make those citizens, they must succeed in their civic duties. We, the people, are the ones who are failing. Let's come together. Let's understand the issues. And so for those of us who are elders, who are in the know, we have a responsibility to educate and to inform. Once the citizens are empowered with knowledge and the understanding of what is really going on, I do know for a fact the average citizen of the world wants a righteous world, a world that is free of hate, racism, bigotry. That's what the average citizen wants.
We did have a situation in Africa where a NATO-cleared engagement in Libya took place that South Africa signed off and allowed to take place under the presidency of Jacob Zuma. Some would argue that that was the biggest own goal in the 20th century for Africa as a step towards realizing what the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism spoke to of becoming one continent.
Remember what I said?
Yeah.
In 1963, NATO was in full force.
Yeah. Again.
Move forward. Come to Libya. NATO was in full force. They knew what Gaddafi was going to do. Remember when he was the chairman of the African Union, Gaddafi had the money If there were any brown envelopes, it would be him passing the brown envelopes to get the vote.
Got it.
Gaddafi was working towards a single currency. Gaddafi was working towards a single military. Gaddafi was getting ready to do what was supposed to be done in 1963. He was moving fast and furious.
Right.
NATO did not want it. He had to be executed.
Right.
So they had to eliminate him.
Quite simply, before we go to a break, we sold ourselves out.
We sure did.
All right, then
We sold ourselves out with Libya. Right. We sold ourselves out in 1963 during the creation of the OAU, which was a compromise outcome. We should have achieved an Africa that spoke with one voice in 1963.
Speaking with